The morning sunlight poured through the tall classroom windows, spilling across rows of desks where restless students tried to stay focused. The smell of pencil shavings and old chalk hung faintly in the air. At the center of the room, on the third row from the front, sat 11-year-old Marcus Reed. Marcus was quiet by nature. He kept his notebooks neatly stacked, his pencils sharp, his handwriting precise. While many of his classmates slouched in their seats or tapped their sneakers against the floor in impatience, Marcus sat upright, attentive, eyes fixed on the blackboard. Today, the lesson was science, his favorite. The teacher scribbled formulas across the board, her chalk tapping sharply with each symbol. She spoke quickly as though daring her students to keep up. "Can anyone tell me," she asked, turning sharply toward the class, "why photosynthesis is essential not only for plants, but for the survival of all living things?" A hush fell. A few kids looked down at their papers, hoping to avoid eye contact. Others shifted nervously, chewing their pens. It was the kind of question that usually met silence. But Marcus raised his hand, calm, confident. The teacher's brows rose, surprised. "Marcus?" she called, her tone almost hesitant. Marcus spoke clearly, his voice steady, though quiet at first. "Photosynthesis converts sunlight into energy that plants use to grow. But more importantly, it releases oxygen as a byproduct. Animals and humans need that oxygen to survive. Without plants, the oxygen cycle would collapse." The class blinked at him. Several jaws dropped. A boy in the back muttered, "Dang," under his breath. Marcus wasn't finished. "Also," he added, "plants store energy in glucose, which becomes food for other organisms. So photosynthesis doesn't just keep plants alive. It supports the entire food chain." The silence that followed was heavy, but not with confusion, with awe. Even the kids who usually teased Marcus leaned forward, impressed. The teacher, however, didn't smile. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Instead of praise, her lips pressed into a thin line as she studied him with something colder than curiosity. Marcus lowered his hand, unaware of the storm about to rise. He had spoken the truth, with the confidence of someone who understood, someone who had studied far beyond his years. But to his teacher, it was not brilliance she saw. It was suspicion. The classroom buzzed for a moment after Marcus's answer. Quiet whispers, exchanged looks, a few kids nudging each other in disbelief. It wasn't often someone gave a response so detailed, so perfectly phrased. But the teacher didn't beam with pride. She didn't nod approvingly or jot his answer on the board. Instead, she turned slowly toward Marcus, her eyes sharp, her expression unreadable. "That was quite an answer," she said at last. Her voice was steady, but there was a tension under it, a strain the students could feel. Marcus glanced around nervously, unsure if he had said too much. "It's true," he said softly, his voice almost apologetic. "Photosynthesis is—" "Yes, yes," she cut him off briskly, waving her hand. "I know what photosynthesis is. The question is, how do you know?" The class went silent again. All eyes swung back to Marcus. He blinked. "I studied it," he answered carefully. "I read about it at home." The teacher's eyes narrowed. "At home?" She tilted her head, her lips pressing thin. "That's quite a sophisticated explanation for someone your age. Are you sure you didn't just memorize it from somewhere?" A ripple went through the room. A few kids shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Some stared down at their desks. Others looked at Marcus with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Marcus sat up straighter. His heart thudded in his chest, but his voice remained calm. "No, ma'am. I understood it. My dad explained it to me when we were studying together." The teacher's eyebrow arched high, disbelief plain on her face. "Your father?" she repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "And what exactly does your father do that makes him an expert in photosynthesis?" Marcus opened his mouth, then hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer without sounding like he was bragging. "He's a scientist," he said finally, choosing the simplest truth. A few students murmured. One boy whispered, "That explains it." But the teacher's face hardened. "Convenient," she said dryly. "How very convenient that your father is a scientist." That would certainly make it easy to impress the class with answers you couldn't possibly have come up with on your own. The words landed like a blow. Marcus stared at her, stunned, while the room grew heavier with silence. The challenge had been issued, not to Marcus's knowledge, but to his honesty. And it wasn't the last time she would press him. The teacher set the piece of chalk down on her desk with a sharp click, then folded her arms tightly across her chest. Her gaze never left Marcus. "Let's be honest here," she said, her tone shifting from skeptical to openly condescending. "There's no way you came up with that explanation on your own. You must have copied it from somewhere. Or maybe you overheard it and repeated it back, word for word." A collective gasp fluttered across the classroom. Several students exchanged wide-eyed looks. Some sat rigid in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, while others leaned forward, curious to see what Marcus would do. Marcus felt the sting immediately. Heat flushed his cheeks, but he didn't shrink into his seat. Instead, he drew a slow breath and answered carefully, "I didn't copy it. I studied. I like science." But the teacher shook her head slowly, her expression growing colder with every word. "No, that's not how this works. Children your age don't speak like that. They don't explain complex processes in such detail. Not unless they're reading it directly from a book." She let her eyes sweep the room, as if inviting the class to share her disbelief. "And I think we can all agree, Marcus doesn't exactly strike us as the type." Her last words hit harder than any accusation. The type. The implication hung in the air like smoke, heavy and bitter. The classroom fell into uneasy silence. A girl in the second row fidgeted, her face tight with discomfort. A boy muttered under his breath, "That's not fair," but quickly looked down when the teacher's head snapped in his direction. Marcus's throat tightened. He had worked so hard, read so much, spent evenings at the dining table with his father explaining concepts most kids his age never heard of. And now all of it, his effort, his passion, was being dismissed with a wave of a hand. "I'm not lying," he said softly but firmly. His eyes met hers, steady despite the sting behind them. The teacher pursed her lips. "We'll see about that," she said coldly. And with those words, Marcus knew she wasn't just doubting him. She was determined to expose him. Marcus's hands tightened around his pencil, but his voice stayed steady. "I study at home," he said carefully. "My dad teaches me science. We read together. He explains things so I can understand them." For a moment, a flicker of surprise crossed the teacher's face, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Your father teaches you science? That's your explanation?" She shook her head slowly, her tone dripping with disbelief. "That sounds less like the truth and more like an excuse." The words hit like a slap. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One boy frowned, muttering, "Why won't she just believe him?" While a girl in the back stared at Marcus, her mouth pressed into a tight line. Marcus sat taller, refusing to let his shoulders sink. "It's not an excuse," he said, firmer this time. "We study almost every night. He says learning is—" "That's enough," the teacher interrupted, her voice rising sharply. She stepped closer to his desk, looming above him, arms crossed tightly. "I don't want stories. I want honesty. And right now, I don't believe you're being honest." A tense hush spread through the classroom. Marcus looked down at his open notebook, the neat lines of handwriting blurring as his eyes stung. He blinked hard, refusing to let the tears come. Slowly, he raised his head again. His voice was quiet but unshaken. "I am being honest. I don't lie." The teacher's expression hardened further, her patience snapping. "Marcus, I have seen too many students try to talk their way out of trouble, and I can tell when someone is making up stories to sound smarter than they are." Whispers rippled through the room now. "That's not right. She's going too far." But the teacher ignored them, focused only on Marcus. "Here's what's going to happen," she continued, her voice brisk and commanding. "I'll be calling your parents this afternoon. We'll settle this in the principal's office." Marcus sat motionless, his hands folded tightly on his desk. He said nothing more, not because he had no words, but because he knew none would matter to her. For her, His truth was already a lie, but she didn't know the truth that was about to walk through her very classroom door. The room felt heavier now, thick with unease. Marcus sat quietly staring at the lines of his notebook, though he wasn't really seeing them. His classmates shifted in their seats, some glancing at him with sympathy, others sneaking uneasy looks at the teacher, who stood stiffly at the front of the room. The teacher picked up a red pen from her desk and tapped it against the chalkboard ledge, her movements sharp and impatient. "This stops now," she declared, her voice cutting through the silence. "I've given you chances to tell the truth, Marcus, and you've chosen to double down. Lying to your teacher is unacceptable." Marcus raised his head slowly. "But I'm not lying," he said, his voice calm, though there was a quiet ache beneath it. The teacher's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's exactly what liars say," she snapped. Then, lifting her chin, she announced, "I will be calling your parents today. We'll meet in the principal's office, and you'll explain yourself there." Gasps rippled through the classroom. A girl in the second row frowned deeply, whispering, "He didn't even do anything." A boy at the back muttered under his breath, "She's not being fair." The students knew the difference between someone trying to get away with mischief and someone speaking from honesty. And what they saw in Marcus was no trick. But the teacher wasn't listening. She stood straighter, her arms crossed, as though she had just delivered justice. Marcus inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply folded his hands on the desk and sat with a quiet dignity that seemed far too grown for his years. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint scratching of a pencil from one corner of the room. The weight of the teacher's accusation lingered over everyone like a cloud. And then, a knock at the classroom door. Every head turned. The handle turned slowly, and the door opened. In stepped a tall black man in a charcoal suit, carrying himself with quiet authority. His presence was calm but commanding, the kind that made people sit a little straighter without knowing why. Marcus's eyes lit up. The teacher froze, her expression faltering for the first time all morning, because the truth, the real truth, had just walked into the room. The tall man closed the classroom door gently behind him, the quiet click sounding louder than it should in the tense silence. He carried no briefcase, no papers, only the calm presence of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where every word carried weight. Marcus straightened in his seat, a mix of relief and pride flickering across his face. "Dad," he said softly. The teacher stiffened. Her eyes darted between Marcus and the man, now standing at the front of the room. She forced a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, you must be Mr. Reed. I was just about to contact you regarding Marcus." The man's gaze swept the room before settling on his son. "I see," he said, his voice deep and even. Then, he turned to the teacher. "What seems to be the problem?" The teacher clasped her hands together, her posture rigid. "Marcus has been less than honest today. He gave a very elaborate explanation in class, far beyond his level, and insisted he learned it from you. When pressed, he continued with that story. I cannot allow dishonesty in my classroom." The man's brow lifted slightly, his expression calm but sharp, like a scalpel. "A story?" he repeated. "Yes," the teacher said firmly. "A story." The man gave the faintest of smiles, though there was no warmth in it. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a leather case. With quiet precision, he placed it on the teacher's desk and flipped it open. The students leaned forward in their seats, craning to see. Inside was a gold medal, round, gleaming, unmistakable. The embossed words caught the light. Nobel Prize in Physics. The teacher's face went slack, her mouth parting in disbelief. Around the classroom, a wave of whispers erupted. "Wait, that's a Nobel Prize?" "No way. His dad won the Nobel." The man closed the case and returned it to his pocket with deliberate care. Then he looked squarely at the teacher. "My son was not lying," he said. "I am a scientist. And yes, I have a Nobel Prize. We study together almost every night. He is curious, bright, and eager to learn. Everything he told you was true, because he understood it, because I made sure he did. The teacher's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of her desk. The authority she had wielded so confidently only moments ago dissolved under the weight of his words and the weight of his achievement. Marcus sat straighter, his chest lifting with quiet pride. For the first time that morning, the eyes on him weren't skeptical. They were full of awe, and the teacher, who had accused him of lying, could do nothing but stare at the truth she had refused to see. For several heartbeats, the classroom was frozen. The weight of what Marcus's father had revealed pressed down on the silence like a stone. The gold of the Nobel Prize medal still seemed to shimmer in everyone's minds, even though it was back in his jacket pocket. Then, the whispers began again, spreading like ripples in water. His dad won a Nobel Prize. That's insane. Marcus wasn't lying at all. Some of the students turned in their seats to look at Marcus. Their expressions changed. No longer doubtful, no longer smirking, but wide-eyed with admiration. A girl in the second row whispered, "That's so cool," before clapping softly. Another student joined in, and then another. Within moments, the classroom was filled with the sound of applause. Marcus blinked in surprise, his face flushing, not with shame this time, but with pride. He sat taller in his seat, shoulders back, chin lifted just slightly. For the first time that morning, the weight of suspicion had been replaced with recognition. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You see," he said quietly, his voice just for Marcus, "the truth always stands." At the front of the room, the teacher's face had drained of color. She stood stiffly, her hands twisting together, her eyes darting from the applauding students to Marcus's father. The authority she had wielded so easily earlier had evaporated. Now she looked small, cornered by her own arrogance. I didn't realize," she stammered, her voice shaky. "I wasn't aware of your credentials." Marcus's father turned his gaze on her, calm but piercing. "You don't need my credentials to believe my son," he said evenly. "You only need respect, something he has earned on his own." The teacher swallowed hard, unable to meet his eyes. Marcus felt the strength of his father's words sink into him. He smiled, just slightly, and when he looked around the classroom, he saw not judgment, but admiration. His classmates saw him differently now. Not the quiet boy making impossible claims, but a student who had stood in his truth until it was undeniable. The applause finally faded, replaced by a reverent hush. Marcus opened his notebook again, his pencil poised above the page, ready to keep learning. And for once, the teacher had no more doubts, no more accusations, only silence. Marcus had not just defended his honesty, he had reclaimed his dignity. Respect once denied was his at last.